Before the first light, the village lay in perfect stillness. No roosters had crowed. No carts rumbled over the stone path. The sky was an inky dome, holding on to the last breath of night before surrendering to dawn. But deep in the heart of the village, behind a humble wooden door warped from decades of wind and weather, a soft rustle stirred the silence. Oswin's eyes opened before his mind caught up. Waking was no longer a choice, it was rhythm. His fingers moved instinctively toward the woolen blanket draped across his chest, pushing it aside slowly. The air inside the cottage was cool, edged with the moisture of stone walls that had not yet felt the warmth of day. His bones ached faintly, but he welcomed the familiar sensation. It meant the world was still turning, and more importantly, the oven still needed tending. He sat up, his breath visible in the pale air, and for a moment, just listened. Nothing, not a whisper beyond the wood. The quiet held its own weight, and in it, Oswin found peace, slipping on his linen shirt. Patched and faded, he moved through the darkness like someone who had memorized the layout of every creaking floorboard. He lit a small oil lamp with a flint and watched as the faint glow danced across the stone walls, illuminating jars of dried herbs, sacks of grain, and bundles of cloth. The scent of last night's embers still clung faintly to the walls, but it was the smell from the covered bowl on the work table that he moved toward first. With a practiced hand, he lifted the cloth and leaned in. The sour, almost sweet aroma of risen dough greeted him. It had fermented overnight patiently, gently under the wool and the chill, just as it had for decades in this very kitchen. Tiny bubbles glistened across its surface. The dough had risen just enough. Not too much. Not too little. Oswin pressed 2 fingers gently into its center. The imprint remained. "Perfect," he whispered to no one, his voice gravelly with sleep. In that moment, it was just him and the dough. No castle taxes, no illnesses, no quarrels among villagers. Just flour, water, salt, and time, his 4 most loyal companions. He moved to the hearth. The fire had gone out, but the coals were still warm. Like a sleeping beast, he knelt and laid new kindling with slow care, placing each twig as though arranging an altar. He whispered something under his breath, not quite a prayer, not quite a spell, just a habit, a thank you. Then struck the flint again. A spark, then flame. The fire came to life timidly, nibbling at the dry wood before catching with a soft whoosh. Shadows jumped across the room. Oswin watched for a few moments, letting the warmth kiss his face. Next came the wood. He pulled from a stack of seasoned oak and birch beside the hearth. The oak burned long and hot. The birch flared quickly, perfect for starting. He arranged them inside the large stone oven at the back of the room, an arched chamber blackened by decades of soot and stories. The oven was his heart, the soul of his trade, his inheritance. It had been here long before him, and it would remain long after. Once the fire was crackling within the belly of the oven. He sat back on his stool and let his muscles rest. There was time now, time for the heat to build, to soak into the thick stone walls of the chamber. Only when the oven had glowed red within and the soot had burned away would it be ready. In this in-between time, Oswin often thought. He remembered his father, who once sat on the same stool, teaching him how to judge heat by feel rather than flame, how to listen to the soft hum of expanding stone, how to know, just by smell, when the loaves were done. Oswin had been only 8 when he first helped his father mix dough in this very room. His hands could barely hold the wooden spoon, but he remembered the laughter, the warmth of the oven, the sense that they were creating something meaningful from next to nothing. Now, decades later, he worked alone, his father long buried in the churchyard beneath the oak. No wife, no children. But the dough rose just the same. He stood and returned to the bowl. The dough had relaxed more in the warmth. He reached into a clay jar for flour and dusted the surface of the table before turning the dough out onto it with a quiet thump. The cold of the stone met the softness of the risen dough like water meeting sand. He folded it over itself, again and again, pressing gently but firmly. His palms remembered every motion. Each push was slow, deliberate, meditative. The dough sighed beneath his hands. Kneading was more than preparation. It was ritual. Outside, the horizon began to glow, with the faintest smear of color blue bleeding into gray. The world was waking, but still far from alert. Oswin kept working, rhythm unbroken. He cut the dough into pieces, weighed by instinct, not scale, rolled each one into a shape that felt right in his hands, round, solid, humble. These would be his morning loaves. Simple, honest, nothing fancy. Just bread to feed the village. The first customers wouldn't arrive for another hour or 2. But Oswin liked being ahead. There was comfort in readiness. The oven fire had settled now, glowing orange and humming with heat. He reached for the long-handled rake and dragged the coals into the ash pit, clearing the floor of the oven. The heat trapped in the stone would now bake the loaves evenly, silently, with no open flame. A dragon's breath without the dragon. He placed the first batch of dough on the wooden pail, slid it deep into the belly of the oven, and closed the heavy iron door. Then, finally, he sat again, outside. The first bird sang, and inside, the scent of bread ancient, honest, soothing began to bloom, warming the oven. The bread was in, the fire was out, but the oven was alive. Oswin leaned back against the wall beside the hearth, palms resting on his knees, and closed his eyes not to sleep, but to listen, to feel. There was a subtle hum in the stone behind him, like the quiet purring of a great beast at rest. The oven retained its heat in a way no open fire could. It did not blaze or boast. It held. It remembered. The birch logs he had used earlier were reduced now to ash and ember. Their job was done, and so began the slow work of the heat, soaked deep into the oven walls, pressing out gently into the belly of the chamber where the loaves now sat. There was no clock to watch, no timer to set. Oswin's senses were the only tools he had ever trusted, and they had never failed him. He stood and approached the oven once more. Its stone door radiated warmth enough to chase the chill from his skin, but not enough to burn. That was the key. It was an art. Really, one passed down more by instinct than instruction. Oswin remembered how his father used to say, "A baker's ear is better than his eye." And it was true. The sound of the oven, the way it sighed when heat was right, the way it settled when coals had done their job, told him far more than any glance could. He crouched and picked up a small iron shovel, sweeping the last of the coals into a side chamber. The floor of the oven had to be perfectly clean now, smooth and ready to cradle the bread without scorching it. A few embers clung to life with orange determination, but Oswin nudged them away, whispering softly as if coaxing a restless child to bed. When he rose, his knees popped faintly. He smiled to himself. It was a familiar sound, like the creak of a wooden beam in the loft or the stretch of old leather. Signs of wear. Yes, but also signs of a life well used. He moved to the work table and brushed away the remaining flour from the surface. The bowl of dough was empty now, its contents transformed into rounds resting inside the oven. But nearby, another bowl awaited, a second batch, this one richer, meant for the midday bake. More water, more honey, a touch of ground rye. These loaves were softer, sweeter, favored by children and elders alike. He covered the bowl again, allowing it to rest in the warmth of the kitchen. He stepped outside for a moment, into the cool breath of early morning. The village was stirring. Faint voices echoed from a nearby stable, someone calling to a stubborn mule. A pair of sparrows chased each other above the thatched roofs, their wings slicing through the silver air. The smell of damp earth and distant chimney smoke wrapped around him like a shawl. Oswin inhaled deeply and let the air rest in his lungs. Then he looked toward the stack of wood beside the door. Each piece had been chosen, carefully cut during late summer, and left to season through the autumn. The oak, in particular, was his pride. Thick, heavy, dense with history. It burned slowly, giving off deep heat, the kind that lingered even after the flame had died. He ran his hand over the split logs, fingers brushing against splinters like braille on a well-worn page. Today, he would need more. With practiced ease, he selected 3 larger pieces and carried them inside, setting them by the hearth for the afternoon bake. Though the morning loaves were cooking now in the residual heat, the next batch those sweet rounds would need a fresher blaze. But not yet. That was for later. Now came the waiting. He poured himself a cup of warm barley water from a clay jug and settled onto the stool near the fire. It wasn't tea, but it was enough to warm his chest. He sipped slowly, eyes vapaste flicking between the oven and the small square window above the table, where light was beginning to shift from pale blue to the soft gold of morning proper. He took out a small knife from his apron and began shaving a block of beeswax. Letting the curls fall into a tin bowl, he used the wax to polish the wooden trays where he placed the baked loaves, an old habit, but one that gave him comfort. The smell of beeswax always reminded him of spring, of flowers and honey, and long days without frost. Time passed quietly. He stood again and approached the oven. The bread was near done. He could smell it. That rich, nutty fragrance that only came when crust was just beginning to turn golden. He placed his hand near the vent and felt the rising warmth. A slow smile crept across his face. The oven had done its job well. He lifted the iron latch with a creak and opened the heavy door. Inside, nestled in the glow of stone and heat, the loaves sat like sun-kissed pillows. Their edges were rounded, their tops cracked slightly from expansion. He tapped one gently with the back of a spoon. It responded with a hollow thump. Done. One by one. He drew them out with the wooden peel, placing them on a rack to cool near the window. The air was still cool enough to kiss the steam from their crusts. Oswin stood there a moment, just breathing it in. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The bread had spoken. As he began preparing the table for slicing, wrapping, and later delivery, he caught sight of his reflection in the window pane, faint, warped by old glass. The lines on his face were deeper now, his beard more salt than pepper, but his eyes still held the same quiet joy they did decades ago, when he baked his first solo loaf under his father's watchful eye, and the oven behind him. It still radiated that same ancient warmth. As the sun crept higher over the village rooftops, Oswin set down his cup, wiped his hands on his apron, and began to prepare for the rest of the day. The heat had been captured. The bread had risen. The baker had done his morning work. And still, the warmth lingered. Linen cloth covering the second bowl on the table. The mixture inside had grown, pushed upward as if breathing in its own slow rhythm. Tiny bubbles danced along the surface, a sign of healthy fermentation. It smelled of grain and thyme, with a faint tang that hinted at life within flour and water. To most, it might seem like simple food. To Oswin, it was something closer to alchemy. This was the base of his midday bread, the second wave of loaves that would feed the village through the afternoon and evening. These would be heartier than the morning rounds, made not only of wheat, but mixed with ground barley and a touch of rye. Less refined, perhaps, but stronger. The kind of bread that sustained laborers in the fields, that sat well beside stew and kept the cold at bay. He ran his fingers around the rim of the bowl, then dipped both hands gently into the dough, turning it over softly as though greeting an old friend. Flour first. He reached for the sack beneath the table and scooped out a handful, tossing it across the surface like snow. It landed lightly, a fine powdering over the worn stone. Then, with careful movement, He turned the dough out of its resting place. It landed with a low, wet sound, soft but sturdy. The air filled with the aroma of fermentation, warm, earthy, alive. Oswin set to work. His hands, though calloused and worn by decades, still moved with elegance. He folded the dough in on itself, rotating it slowly, always with the same intention: to shape, to strengthen, to ready it for fire. The folding brought out the tension in the gluten, a subtle resilience that would hold the bread's form in the oven. But there was more to it than mechanics. Each press was like breathing life into the loaf. He worked in silence. The only sounds were the low shuffle of dough over flour and the occasional creak of the table beneath his weight. Outside, the village was beginning to bustle. Voices rose in the distance, calls between neighbors. The bark of a dog, the creaking wheels of a farmer's cart. But inside, the world remained small and sacred. He divided the dough into 6 equal portions, rolling each one gently between his palms. He could feel the tension inside them, the readiness to rise, to bloom into bread. He shaped the loaves into rounds, pressing them firmly, smoothing the seams. Once shaped, they rested briefly on the table, nestled in flour to keep them from sticking. Oswin used this short pause to reach for a smaller bowl, a separate, special mix he had prepared late the night before. It was a sourdough starter, older than many of the villagers, a bubbling mass of flour and water teeming with life. A piece of this would be added to the next batch of dough after lunch. He stirred it gently, feeding it with fresh flour, murmuring under his breath like a gardener tending a cherished plant. He wiped his hands on his apron, white with the ghost of flour, and stepped back. The loaves had relaxed slightly, ready for their final shaping. He lifted each one again, pressing gently with his thumbs to tighten their form, then placed them in linen-lined baskets to rest. They would wait now, proofing while the oven was warmed again. Oswin returned to the firewood and chose 3 slender logs of birch, placing them one by one into the hearth. He did not need much heat for this batch, just enough to refresh the oven's belly. The birch would burn quickly, delivering a short burst of flame that would settle into embers before noon. He lit the kindling and watched the fire take. It crackled and snapped, sending flickers of gold dancing along the walls. The smell of birch smoke mingled with bread and yeast, forming a perfume he had known his whole life. As the oven warmed, he cleaned the work table, sweeping away the flour and brushing off crumbs from the morning's loaves. Then he turned to the cooling rack. The first batch had rested long enough. He lifted a loaf and brought it to his nose. Still warm. The crust was firm, but not hard. He pressed it gently, resilient, yet tender. A tap on the bottom yielded the hollow sound he wanted. He smiled. He wrapped each loaf carefully in linen, folding the fabric like a swaddling cloth. These would go to the old widow down the lane, the family of 7 near the well, the shepherd boy who always brought wildflowers as payment. Bread was coin, but it was also kindness. It carried weight beyond nutrition. It was gesture, memory, care. Oswin placed the wrapped loaves into a large basket and left them near the door. He would deliver them once the second bake was underway. For now, he returned to the baskets of rising dough and gently pulled back the cloth covers. They were ready. He took his blade, a small, curved knife with a bone handle, and began scoring the tops of each loaf. Not randomly, with precision. A cross for protection, a swirl for the harvest, a wave for the river that fed the mill. Each mark had meaning, even if few remembered them now. His father once told him that bread without a mark was like a letter without a name. And Oswin believed it still. One by one, he transferred the loaves onto the wooden peel. The oven, now glowing with even heat, stood ready to receive them. He opened the door, swept the ashes to one side, and slid the bread in, listening for that soft shh as dough met hot stone. He closed the door and stepped back. Then he waited, not idly, not impatiently, but with respect. Bread could not be rushed. He poured himself another cup of barley water and sat by the fire, arms folded across his chest. Outside, the sun had fully risen, painting the rooftops with light. The village day had begun. But within the baker's cottage, time still moved by the rhythm of dough and flame. The first loaves had been prepared, and the second were already singing in the heat. The village awakens. By the time Oswin stood to check the second batch of loaves, the sun had cleared the hills beyond the village, its pale gold spilling down the narrow lanes like warm honey. Long shadows clung to the stone cottages and thatched roofs. But they were soft now, no longer the cold stretches of night, but gentle reminders that the day was unfolding. Slowly, like bread rising in a proving basket, the scent of baking filled the bakery like a hymn. It was the kind of smell that sank into the walls, into the wood, into the clothes on Oswin's back. Flour, yeast, the deep warmth of crust forming against hot stone. It was memory, comfort, hunger, and satisfaction all at once. He opened the oven door just a fraction and was greeted by a wave of heat. Fragrant and rich, the loaves had begun to split along their scored marks, just as they should. Crusts were blooming open like petals, the surface crackling as if whispering thanks to the fire. Satisfied, he let them finish in peace and turned his attention to the outside world. The village was fully awake now. From the bakery door, he could see the old cobbler already seated on his stool beneath the eaves of his cottage, bent over a worn boot with fingers that moved slow but sure. Across the lane, a young boy, Ludo, the blacksmith's son, chased after a goat that had broken loose from its tether, shrieking with laughter as the goat danced just out of reach. A woman swept the front of her home with long, even strokes, her hair still wrapped in a scarf from sleep. Oswin leaned against the doorframe, wiping his flour-dusted hands on his apron. The village breathed in rhythm with itself, people going about their tasks with quiet purpose. Some humming, some speaking low, some simply existing in the soft calm that only morning could provide. And then came the first knock. A gentle tap, not urgent. Oswin turned to find a familiar face peeking in through the open door. Morning. Master Oswin. Came a young voice, Elsbeth, the miller's daughter, no more than 8 years old, with 2 braids and smudges of sleep still under her eyes. "You're early," Oswin said, smiling down at her. "Mama said if I came first, we might get the bread with the golden crust." He laughed softly and walked to the basket of wrapped loaves, choosing one of the warmest, still slightly steaming. "Golden crust for a golden girl," he said. Handing it over, Elsbeth held it like treasure, cradling it in her arms. "Thank you, Master Oswin. Tell your mother the butter will melt better if you don't wait too long." She grinned and ran off, leaving a faint trail of excitement in her wake. Another figure approached, not running this time, but hobbling. It was old Tom, the village's eldest soul, whose back had bent nearly in half, but whose mind remained sharp as flint. "Do you still have one with oats?" "Lead?" Tom asked. Oswin nodded and wrapped a heavier loaf studded with rolled oats and bits of dried apple. "For the joints," he said. "It'll keep the cold out." Tom nodded slowly. "And remind me of harvests that don't come no more." The exchange was quiet, almost ceremonial. Bread for coin. Yes, but more often for news. Smiles. Shared memory. One by one, villagers came. A young mother with her newborn wrapped tight in linen, asking for a soft loaf she could dip in broth. A pair of twin brothers with wiped knees, earning a roll each for having fetched Oswin kindling the day before. Even Father Eldrick from the chapel, his robes lifted slightly to keep from dragging along the damp earth, came to collect his 2 round loaves for the altar. Each person brought something coin. Thanks. Herbs. A spool of thread. Sometimes only stories, and left with more than just bread. They left with warmth, with connection, and as they came and went, Oswin never hurried. He greeted each with the same quiet reverence. He knew how important the first food of the day was. It wasn't just sustenance. It was reassurance that the world still turned as it should. Between each visit, he returned to his oven, removing the second batch of loaves and placing them beside the first. These were darker, more rustic, their crusts thicker and rougher to the touch, but they smelled glorious smoky, grainy, wholesome, the kind of bread one broke with stew or dipped into thick vegetable pottage at day's end. He let them cool near the window, which was now glowing with soft amber light. A breeze drifted through the crack in the shutters, carrying with it the scent of earth, moss, distant hay, and the faint smoke of other chimneys joining his own. Oswin paused. He wiped his hands once more and stepped outside, letting the sun hit his face. The village, in full motion now, continued on. No one was in a rush. There was no clang of machines, No market cries or whistles, only the sound of feet on stone, water sloshing in wooden buckets, voices greeting each other by name. He glanced back toward his oven. There was more work to be done, new dough to prepare, deliveries to make, ash to clean. But in this moment, in this gentle hush of morning, now fully arrived, he allowed himself to simply be. The bread had risen, the village had awakened, and the day, warm and steady, was just beginning. The quiet art of scoring and shaping. As the sun lifted higher above the slate-roofed cottages and the early bustle of the village mellowed into the steadier rhythm of mid-morning, Oswin turned his focus back inward to the table, to the dough, to the sacred craft that required no words. It was time to score the loaves. To the untrained eye, it might have seemed like a simple act, taking a sharp blade to the surface of soft dough just before baking. But to Oswin, and to his father before him, scoring was not merely function. It was form. It was the silent signature of the baker, a quiet conversation between hands. Blade and the living mass of bread. He reached into the small wooden drawer beneath his table and pulled out his lame, a curved blade attached to a smooth, dark wooden handle worn by time and oil. The blade had belonged to his father, and his father's father, though he had sharpened and replaced the metal several times. The handle had remained unchanged, its surface shaped by the thumbs of generations. On the table lay 12 dough rounds, each plump with proofing, their surfaces dusted lightly with flour. They rested beneath linen cloths, asleep in their final moments before fire. Oswin peeled back each cloth gently, as though waking something sacred. The air inside the bakery had shifted again. It was warmer now, heavy with the scent of grain and the low hum of rising energy. The fire in the oven had settled into a patient glow, ready to receive these loaves when the time was right. But first, the mark. Oswin picked up the first round, holding it in the palm of one hand, while his blade hovered just above. His other hand guided the tool, slow and certain. One smooth slash, a single crescent, graced the dough's surface. It was the shape of the waxing moon, a symbol of change, of growth, of quiet renewal. He often used it for the sick, for those recovering from fever or grief. The second loaf received a cross, each line precise and centered. It was the most traditional, the mark of the village, said to ward off evil and ensure an even rise. Oswin remembered how, as a boy, he once asked his father if the cross truly protected people. His father had replied, "It protects the spirit." That's what bread is meant to do. The third loaf bore a sheaf of wheat, etched with fine lines and a steady hand, a prayer for a good harvest. This one would go to the miller's family, whose stones ground Oswin's flour, whose daughter had come just that morning for the golden-crusted loaf. He moved from loaf to loaf, never rushing. Some bore spirals, representing the wind. Others, a braided twist, mimicking the knots in the hair of the village women. There were leaf patterns, simple dots, in clusters of 5, even one with a heart etched so subtly it would barely be seen once baked. These weren't just designs. They were stories, messages, blessings. Scoring dough for Oswin was like inscribing a page. It was his way of speaking to those who might never hear his voice, elders with fading ears, children too young for books, those who grieved silently. Bread could reach them all. And the shaping, the shaping was its own form of meditation. Oswin returned to a fresh batch of dough, ready for the afternoon rise. He turned it out onto the floured table with reverence, the soft mass folding and slumping like a sleepy animal. His hands moved over it with calm authority, pressing, tucking, folding, rotating. Each motion was deliberate. Press in, turn, fold back, cup the heel of the palm, feel the tension grow. The dough responded like clay under a sculptor's fingers. It yielded and pushed back. It remembered what it had been and what it was becoming. In shaping, Oswin wasn't simply preparing something to be eaten. He was continuing a lineage, keeping a rhythm older than kings, older than the village itself. The silence in the bakery during these moments was almost sacred. Only the soft rustle of linen, the dull thud of dough meeting table, and the occasional whoosh of flour being dusted through fingers broke the hush. Outside, the world moved on, carts passed. Chickens clucked. Someone called out for missing boots, but inside this room, time slowed. It folded into itself. It rose like bread. Oswin paused after shaping the last loaf and sat on the stool, wiping his brow with the sleeve of his tunic. There was peace here. Peace in knowing that this simple act of scoring and shaping was enough. That even if no one noticed the pattern on their bread, some part of them would feel it, in the way the loaf sat in the hand, in the way it tore, in the way it fed. He looked down at the rows of waiting loaves, each resting with its own story carved in flour and anticipation. The blade rested beside them now, its work done for the morning. Oswin cleaned it gently with a cloth, then placed it back in its drawer. Not hurried, not forgotten, just resting, like the loaves. He leaned back and listened. The oven gave a soft sigh as the coals shifted. The loaves rose quietly under linen covers. And outside, the bell of the chapel rang once mid-morning. Stillness returned. And in that stillness, a dozen loaves dreamed of heat and fire. They were ready to be born. A visit from the village herbalist. It was nearing the quiet heart of the morning, when the first flurry of work had settled. And the second wave had yet to begin, when Oswin heard the knock. 3 soft taps, rhythmic and patient, like the beat of a walking stick on old stone. He wiped his hands on his apron, brushing away a layer of flour that had settled over his fingers like dust on parchment. Then he opened the door and was met with the scent of crushed leaves, moss, and a faint trace of lavender. "Good day, old flame," came a voice like creaking bark. Standing at the threshold was Marwyn, the village herbalist. She was small and sharp-eyed, wrapped in layers of forest-colored cloth, her gray hair braided and tied with tiny bones and sprigs of mint. In one hand she carried a woven satchel bursting with green, and in the other, her ever-present walking stick carved with symbols Oswin had never been able to decipher. He stepped aside without a word, and she entered like the changing of the season. Inside, the scent of warm bread and wood smoke collided gently with her arrival. The bakery felt brighter somehow, or perhaps simply more awake. "I've brought you thyme and yarrow, as promised," she said, setting her bag on the table, "and a bit of elderflower. You'll need it soon. The rains are coming early this year." Oswin raised a brow as he took the bundle from her. "Do the flowers speak to you again?" "They always have," she replied, a twinkle in her eye. "It's people who refuse to listen." He chuckled softly and reached for a small pot to boil water. "Sit. I'll make us something warm." She did, lowering herself slowly onto the stool near the hearth, her walking stick leaning against the wall beside her, as Oswin stoked the embers and placed the kettle over the fire. The two sat in companionable silence. It was a silence that didn't need filling, a silence earned through years of shared mornings like this one. "I saw Elsbeth running down the road earlier," Merwin said, plucking a small green leaf from her sleeve. "She held that bread like a knight holds a sword. She deserved it." Oswin replied, pouring water into the pot. "She was first." "As always?" Merwin nodded. "That child could outrun the wind if you dangled bread ahead of her." He set 2 earthen cups on the table and reached for a small jar of dried chamomile. But Merwin waved her hand. "No, no. Today you drink mine." She leaned forward and produced a small bundle wrapped in waxed cloth. Unwrapping it, she revealed a mix of dried petals, crumbled bark, and something that shimmered faintly gold. Oswin sniffed the blend. Linden, lemon balm, and a pinch of dream root. She said with a quiet smile. He raised a brow. "That'll have me asleep before the loaves finish." Merwin gave a soft laugh. "Only if your heart needs rest more than your hands." He obliged, placing the mixture into the pot. Soon, the scent of the herbs began to bloom in the room floral. Woody, slightly sweet. It curled into the corners of the bakery like a gentle fog. As the tea steeped, Merwin pulled from her satchel a small pot tied with twine. "For your joints," she said, pushing it toward him. "Comfrey and wild marjoram. Use it in the evenings. Your shoulders are beginning to tell on you." Oswin grunted but accepted the gift. "You always know," he muttered. "I always watch," she replied. "And your movements have slowed this week." They sipped the tea together, letting the silence return, broken only by the soft crackle of the fire and the occasional rustle of linen as the bread continued to rise. Outside, the wind had shifted. Oswin could feel it through the gaps in the shutters, a breeze coming from the west. Cooler than before, the kind that carried news from the forest. or whispers of rain clouds not yet seen. Merwin noticed it too. "It'll storm before week's end," she said, setting down her cup. "The river reeds told me. I'll double the salt in the next batch," Oswin said. "Storm bread keeps longer." She nodded approvingly. There was a long pause after that. One Oswin did not rush. He enjoyed Merwin's visits. She brought more than herbs. She brought pause, perspective, the weight of the woods. Her knowledge was not loud, but it lingered, like the scent of her satchel, green and old and wise. As the tea cooled and the oven settled into its perfect heat, Merwin rose slowly. "I must be off," she said. "The weaver's boy has a cough again. I've told her not to let him sleep so near the floor. But do they ever listen?" Oswin handed her a small parcel, 2 slices of the morning's oat bread wrapped in cloth. "Give him this, warmed with honey. It may soothe him more than your roots." She took it, pressing the bundle to her chest. "I'll return in 3 days," she said. "And you'll need nettles by then." He gave a small bow. "May the wind be kind to your bones, and may your crusts not burn," she called back, stepping through the door. When she was gone, Oswin stood for a moment by the open threshold, letting the fresh air and faint scent of wild flowers drift into the bakery. Then, with quiet purpose, he turned back to his dough. The fire still glowed. The loaves still waited. But the world felt softer now, gentler, as though the herbs and her presence had folded themselves into the walls, baking for the nobles. The letter had arrived the previous evening, tied with blue ribbon and sealed with the crest of House Redmere, the falcon and fox. Gold on deep green wax. Oswin recognized it immediately. Not just the seal, but the sharp scent of lavender pressed between the folded parchment. A detail only noble households cared for. Inside, the message was brief, though ornate in phrasing, for the upcoming gathering of Lord Halford and his guests. We request 12 sweet loaves, fine and fragrant, to be delivered by the morning after next. As always, your discretion and craftsmanship are appreciated. No name signed, only the crest again at the bottom impressed hard enough to dent the paper. Oswin had received such notes many times before, and though they were never accompanied by warmth or familiarity, he knew what they asked for. Perfection. Not just bread, but presentation. Not just nourishment, but pride. And not a single burn mark. So this morning, before most of the village had stirred, even before the herbalist's visit, he had begun preparing the dough for the noble loaves. Now, as the sun crept higher into the late morning sky, he stood once again before the work table, sleeves rolled, mind focused, hands moving with the precision of ritual. But this time, the dough was different. It was rich, where the common loaves were built on barley, rye, or hard-earned wheat. These loaves drank in fine white flour from the south lighter, softer, more expensive. He added a touch of milk instead of water, a drizzle of honey, a cracked egg, a whisper of cinnamon from the merchant's stall at the spring fair. Bits of dried pear and golden raisins, soaked overnight in sweet wine, were folded in gently. He worked in silence. The room smelled not of sourdough and firewood, but of sugar and spice, warm fruit and memory. It was a different kind of bread, one that required not only technical care, but delicate balance. Too much fruit, and the loaves would collapse. Too little, and the nobles would write back not in complaint, of course, but in absence, and absence, for a village baker, was louder than criticism. Oswin shaped each loaf into an oval, dusted lightly with almond flour to create a golden crust. He scored them not with rustic symbols, but with elegant arcs and curves, feathered patterns meant to catch the eye of those who rarely looked twice at the hands that made their food. The loaves rested now beneath fresh linen, breathing in their final proof. And Oswin, he sat on his stool, sipping cool water, watching them like a father watches a child's first steps. He remembered his first noble commission. He had been barely 20 then, working in the kitchens of the Halford estate, under the head baker, Master Edric, a tall man with fingers like iron tongs and eyes that missed nothing. It was a life of precise measurements, polished copper, and relentless pressure. He remembered the way the noble women had laughed, light and airy, as they passed the kitchen windows, the way the servants had whispered, moving in tight orbits of gossip, the way the steward scowled if a crust cracked unevenly. And he remembered, most of all, the moment he burned a tray of honey loaves, only slightly, only 2 of 12. But Edric had scolded him sharply, and he had stood there, face burning, feeling small as ash. It was then he realized something vital. He didn't hate the nobles. He simply didn't need them. Their praise, their frowns, their silences, none of it mattered beside the fire and the bread. The oven was honest. It either rose or it didn't. It either burned or it baked. The oven, like the dough, had no title, only truth. He had left the estate that same winter and returned to the village, building the bakery with his own hands from his father's foundation. He hadn't looked back until letters like this arrived, bearing blue ribbons and sweet requests. The linen cloths began to flutter. The dough had finished its rise. Oswin stood slowly, rolling his shoulders, then opened the oven door. The coals had settled, the heat steady. He swept the stone floor clean again and began transferring the loaves, one by one, with gentle hands. The oven accepted them without complaint. The door closed. The wait began. He did not pace. He did not fret. He knew the rules. These loaves would bake slower than the morning's bread, their sugar caramelizing, the fruit releasing steam. He adjusted the vent, letting just a breath of air escape. Too much, and they would dry. Too little, and they would split. While he waited, he prepared the delivery basket, This one was lined with fresh cloth linen, stitched by the seamstress who lived 3 doors down. Pale cream with embroidered vines. He placed bay leaves between the folds, not for taste, but for scent. It would arrive smelling of forest and feast. He also prepared a note, handwritten, simple, unsigned. As requested, 12 loaves, best served warm, with patience. The smell of the baking shifted, from soft and mild to deep, complex, golden. He approached the oven, opened the door a fraction. The crusts had colored beautifully, shining with a soft glaze from the egg wash. No splits, no burn. Perfect. He removed them one by one, placing them on the rack near the window. The steam curled upward in elegant ribbons. The fruit had not burst. The dough had not collapsed. Each loaf stood proud and silent, waiting for hands that would never know their making. Oswin wrapped them 2 by 2 in linen, stacked them carefully in the basket, and tied the ribbon around the lid green, like the crest. A stable boy from the estate would arrive within the hour. The work was done. The fire dimmed. The noble loaves had been made. And as Oswin cleaned his blade and wiped the table down once more, he smiled not for the nobles, nor for their praise, which would never come, but because the bread had risen. Even here, even now, that was all that ever mattered. A brief walk through the market. By midday, the bakery was quiet again. The noble loaves had been taken. The morning rounds delivered. Only a faint aroma lingered, warm crust, dried fruit. A shadow of cinnamon caught in the folds of the linen towels. The oven, though still radiating gentle heat, had been swept of ash, the last embers allowed to sigh themselves into rest. Oswin stood at the threshold of his doorway and stretched. The sun hung high now, filtered through the soft gauze of drifting clouds. It wasn't hot. Autumn had begun its slow descent, but the light carried a clarity that only came once the dew had gone. The breeze was mild, brushing his face with the scent of dry hay and smoke from distant chimneys. He decided it was a good day to visit the market. He didn't often leave the bakery for long. The rhythms of the dough, the timing of heat and rest, kept him anchored. But today, with the afternoon batch still in its early stages of fermentation, and the orders complete, he allowed himself the rare pleasure of stepping away, pulling his wool cloak over his shoulders. Oswin locked the door behind him, not out of fear, but habit. The village was honest. Still, flour sacks were tempting to children. The road to the square was lined with life. A boy pushed a wheelbarrow full of turnips. Humming something off-key, a washerwoman leaned out of her window, shaking a rug into the street while gossiping with a neighbor on the ground below. A hound trotted past with a string of sausages in its mouth, chased by a flustered apprentice butcher yelling in vain. And then came the market square. Though small by city standards, the square was the village's heartbeat. Stalls lined the perimeter like a patchwork of color-red cloth. Green awnings, faded blue umbrellas patched with old thread, Wooden carts displayed their offerings proudly. Baskets of late pears, bundles of carrots still dusted with soil, eggs nestled in straw, wool skeins hung in loops beside cured meat, and skeins of onion tied together like jewelry. The sounds were a soft riot. Laughter, bartering, the clink of coin, the rustle of burlap, and the occasional shout from someone catching a runaway goose. Oswin moved slowly through it all, nodding to familiar faces. Oswin, called Marcy, the herbalist's apprentice, waving from behind a stall brimming with dried leaves and flowers. Merwin said you'd be looking for nettles soon. He smiled. 3 days, she said. 2, if the wind keeps turning, the girl replied, tossing him a small sachet of lavender. For your shelves. He accepted it with a nod. How's her knee? She says it's fine, Marcy said, rolling her eyes. But she grimaces every time she bends. Won't listen to me. They never do. Oswin chuckled and moved on. He passed the weaver's stand, pausing to run his fingers along a fresh bolt of linen. The weaver, a tall, quiet man with thread-dusted sleeves, handed Oswin a small scrap. For your bread wraps, he said simply. From the last cut, Oswin tucked it into his pocket and thanked him with a look rather than words. At the far end of the square, he stopped at a produce stall manned by a wide-hipped woman with a laugh like thunder. Oswin, you're a ghost these days, she said, thumping a pumpkin into his hands. I live by the fire. Isolde, he replied. The dough would revolt if I strayed too long. Well, it won't bite if you give it something sweet, she said. This one's yours. You'll make something wonderful with it, I'm sure. He added it carefully to his satchel. From the spice merchant, he bought a finger of ginger and a small pouch of anise. From the egg seller, 6 pale brown eggs with feathers still clinging to their shells. From a wandering boy with nimble fingers and dirt-smudged cheeks, he traded a stale heel of yesterday's loaf for a handful of walnuts. And all the while, he listened, not just with his ears, but with his whole presence. He listened to the rhythms of village life. A woman mourning a lost sheep. A couple whispering about a wedding next spring. A baker from the next town boasting about his new chimney. He listened to the sighs, the laughter, the bargaining dances. It was in this swirl of voices that he felt most connected not to one person, but to the invisible thread that bound them all. He sat briefly on the low stone wall at the edge of the square, taking out a crust of bread from his pouch and nibbling it, while watching the cloud shadows roll across the stalls. It reminded him of his father, who once said, "You learn more about a village by listening than by baking for it." Perhaps he was right. Oswin finished the crust and stood, stretching his back once more, his basket now full, not just with goods, but with texture fabric, sound, color, mood. He turned toward home. As he walked the road back to the bakery, he passed the chapel, where the old bell chimed once, signaling mid-afternoon. He would need to tend to the dough again soon. He reached his door, unlocked it, and stepped inside. The scent welcomed him home, fermenting wheat, the faint echo of smoke, lavender from Marcy's pouch. He set his basket down on the table and unwrapped the ginger. Its scent was sharp, bright, grounding. There was still bread to shape, still loaves to rise, still heat to summon. But in the quiet that returned with him, Oswin felt full not with food, but with the small, quiet joy of being part of a world that moved gently around him, baking with children. The dough had risen again. It sat in the wide wooden bowl, plump and proud, breathing beneath its cloth like a contented animal asleep by the hearth. Oswin had returned from the market just in time any later, and the yeast would have carried on without him, stretching too far, turning slack. But now, at the perfect hour, the dough was supple and ready, just as he reached for the flour sack to begin kneading. A knock came at the door, quick, light, insistent. Not a customer's knock. No, this one carried mischief. He opened the door to find 3 faces looking up at him, round-eyed, dirt-smudged, bursting with the impatience of youth. "You promised," said Mila, eldest daughter of the carpenter, her hands already dusted with flour, though she hadn't yet stepped inside. "We brought mint for trade," piped up Tomlin, the blacksmith's son, holding a sprig like a sword, "and eggs," added little Fenna, her tunic 2 sizes too large and a crooked braid falling over one shoulder. Oswin chuckled. "Come in." Then, but no shouting, no climbing, and no throwing flour unless it's in your hands. They didn't answer, only grinned and rushed in, carrying the wild energy of the village square with them. This wasn't the first time they'd come, once every few weeks, when the ovens weren't too hot and his schedule was forgiving. Oswin opened the bakery to the children. It began years ago, with Mila's older brother, and now had become a quiet tradition. Not many came, only those who asked kindly and brought something in trade. Herbs, eggs, a song, or simply a promise to sweep the floor. Today's dough had already been set aside for them, different from the daily rounds. Less salt, a little sugar, and a touch of milk to soften the crumb. Perfect for little hands and little mouths. He pulled the bowl to the center of the table, sprinkled flour on its surface, and invited them around. Their hands dove in immediately. Mila was precise, folding and tucking like a weaver working threads. Tomlin was enthusiastic, pressing with all his weight, occasionally thumping the dough like a stubborn anvil. Fenna poked and giggled, more fascinated by the stickiness on her fingers than by shaping anything useful. Oswin moved among them like a patient conductor. "Too much flour. Tomlin," he said gently. "It'll be dry as parchment, like the preacher's sermons." Tomlin grinned. "Exactly like that," Oswin replied, and the room filled with laughter. He showed them how to fold the dough in half, press it down, and turn it. how to shape it into balls and pull the surface tight. Their loaves were irregular, some too small, some with odd lumps, but that didn't matter. Each one bore the joy of its maker. Then came the fun part. Decorating. He gave them a small bowl of dried berries, another of sunflower seeds, and a jar of honey thinned with warm water. They painted faces onto the dough, made shapes of animals and stars. One loaf had ears. Another had a tail. Mine's a dragon, declared Mila. It looks like a turtle, said Tomlin. It's a sleeping dragon, Mila insisted. They curl up. Oswin nodded. All the best dragons do, once the shaping was done. He helped them place their creations onto a floured tray. The oven had been reawakened just enough warm, not hot, so the loaves would bake gently and brown slowly. As they waited, the children sat on the floor, backs against the wall, their knees drawn up, cheeks flushed with heat and excitement. Oswin gave them cups of water and slices of his morning bread, spread with a little butter and plum jam from the cellar. They ate quietly, watching the oven with reverence. A silence fell, the good kind, the kind that settles between people when something meaningful is happening, and no one wants to ruin it with words. Soon, the smell began to rise. Not the deep scent of sourdough or the rich tang of rye, but something sweeter, lighter. It carried laughter and soft crusts, the kind that didn't crack too hard against baby teeth. The scent filled the room, floated through the window and into the street, where even passing neighbors turned their heads and smiled. Oswin peeked into the oven. Golden, slightly lopsided. One loaf had lost its ear. Perfect. He removed the tray and set it on the table, warning them. Hot. Don't touch yet. But of course, they leaned close anyway, eyes wide. Fenna whispered, "They smell like dreams." Oswin smiled, not correcting her. When they had cooled enough, he placed each loaf into a small cloth wrap, nothing fancy, just a square of linen tied with twine. The children clutched them like treasures. "Now remember," he said, crouching to their level. "You eat these with clean hands, sitting down. No feeding them to the chickens, and no throwing them at Tomlin." Fenna raised her hand. "But what if Tomlin starts it?" Oswin raised an eyebrow. "Then you throw something softer." They laughed again, louder this time, and the bakery echoed with the sound. As they left, Mila turned back and said, "Next time we'll bring cinnamon." Oswin nodded. "Next time, you bake for your parents." And then they were gone, scampering down the lane, their tiny loaves clutched like secrets, their laughter trailing behind them like ribbons in the wind. The bakery grew quiet again. The flour had settled. The table was dusted with tiny handprints, and Oswin, standing alone once more, felt a warmth no oven could produce. Storms and shadows. By late afternoon, the sky had changed. What had been a pleasant drift of cotton-white clouds had thickened into a low ceiling of slate, dragging shadows across the village like a woolen shroud. The wind, once soft and playful, had turned restless, gusting down alleys and rattling shutters with a purpose that couldn't be ignored. Oswin stood in the doorway of his bakery, sleeves rolled, arms crossed, watching the signs unfold. He had seen it many times before, the stillness before a storm, the way the air held its breath, the way the birds disappeared from the sky, the way the light dimmed, not like evening, but like memory fading behind closed eyes. He turned back inside and closed the door, slipping the wooden bolt into place with a hollow thud. The warmth of the bakery closed around him once more, soft and steady. He would not need to go out again tonight. Not if the rain came as he expected. The fire had been rekindled for the final bake of the day. This dough was heavier, a blend of rye and coarse barley, thick with crushed herbs and caraway. It was bread meant for storing, for slicing thin and toasting dry. Oswin called it storm bread, though none in the village knew the name. He baked it only when the air smelled like this wet, heavy, and electric. He kneaded slowly, letting the rhythm settle into his spine. Press, turn, fold. He did not hum, did not speak. The room, though warm, had taken on a weight, the kind that came not from flour or fire, but from something older, memory. The wind howled suddenly, loud enough to whistle through the chimney, and Oswin paused mid-fold, his hand resting on the soft mound of dough. The sound pulled him back, years and years, to a different storm, a darker one. He had been younger, barely 30. The bakery still smelled new then, its beams freshly carved, its stones still settling, and she had been there. Ira. Her name was never spoken aloud now, not from grief, but from reverence, as though saying it might dissolve the fragile thread that held her in his thoughts. He had loved her quietly, as he loved most things, not with declarations or drama, but with the daily rhythm of bread and breath. She would sit in the window during bakes, knitting slowly, eyes lifted to the light beyond the glass. She had a laugh, like clinking spoons, and a mind that remembered every herb's name in 2 languages. And then came the winter sickness. It crept into the village with the fog, took the children first, then the old, then the strong. Ira had gone within 3 days. And the worst part, the oven was still warm when she passed. That, somehow, had hurt more than the cold. Oswin let the memory pass over him like the wind outside, uninvited, but familiar. He folded the dough once more and placed it in its basket to rise. Then he walked to the back of the room, to the shelf above the small writing desk where her dried herbs still hung, now brittle and faded, untouched in all these years. He reached up and took down the oldest bundle, lavender and marjoram, and held it for a moment. The scent was faint, but it was there. He smiled softly, then returned it to its place. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance. The wind had picked up its pace. Rain had not yet come, but the clouds had begun to sink low enough that the rooftops wore them like cloaks. Oswin returned to the oven, The fire was steady, not too hot. He fed it 2 logs of old birch, dry and split. The flames caught immediately, dancing like the laughter he once knew. He uncovered the dough. It had risen beautifully, round and full, as if nothing outside mattered. He shaped it into thick rounds, scored them not with symbols, but with single, strong lines, slashes like shields, meant to keep in strength rather than tell stories. He loaded them into the oven just as the first drops of rain began to patter against the window. They came softly at first, a sprinkle, then a drizzle, then a steady percussion, drumming against the roof and stone with a rhythm as old as the hills. The rain found every crevice, every crack in the shutters, every weak tile. It made the bakery feel smaller, wrapped in sound. Oswin lit a lantern and placed it on the table, watching as the shadows shifted across the flour-dusted floor. The loaves baked behind the oven door, silent and strong. He brewed himself a cup of tea, just water and nettles, and sat by the window. The rain blurred the outside world. Houses became shapes. Streets became rivers. Voices faded. And yet, inside, the bakery held firm. The fire glowed. The bread rose. The scent of toasted seeds and cracked grain slowly filled the room, pushing back the cold. Oswin took a slow sip of tea. It was bitter, but grounding. He had long ago stopped asking why storms came, why people left, why things broke. Some answers did not bake well with bread, but he did know this. The oven was honest. The fire could be fed, and the bread would always rise, so long as one remembered to wait. He stood again, checked the loaves, and opened the oven door. Golden crusts stared back at him hard and beautiful, like stones from the riverbank. He removed them carefully and set them to cool by the lantern light. The storm howled. The shadows stretched. And inside the bakery, Oswin smiled. The evening orders. The storm had settled into its rhythm now, no longer crashing in wild bursts, but murmuring steadily like a tired lullaby. Rain poured in sheets across the stone streets, turning the village lanes into shallow streams. Chimneys smoked quietly, and every window glowed like a lantern behind fogged glass. Inside the bakery, Oswin prepared for his final ritual of the day. The evening orders. Though he seldom advertised it, the villagers knew he would still bake past sunset on stormy days. Not out of duty, but out of care. Bread, in weather like this, was more than food. It was reassurance. It was something solid, something warm, something to hold when the cold wind scratched at the shutters and memories pressed too close. The storm-bred loaves had cooled to a perfect warmth, still fragrant, still slender at the core. Each round sat firm and quiet on the cooling rack, their crusts etched with the deep scoring he had given them earlier. Oswin set to work wrapping them one by one. He used cloth, not paper, folded neatly, not hurried. He added a bay leaf to some, a sprig of rosemary to others not for flavor, but for feeling. These little gestures mattered, even if no one ever mentioned them. At the small table near the windows, he prepared 4 parcels. The first was for Widow Hesta, who had lost her son in the last harvest. She no longer came to the bakery herself, but her niece stopped by most evenings to collect what she called the quiet loaf. Oswin always gave her the softest crust. The second was for the Carricks, 7 people in 2 rooms, with 5 children and a grandmother who still told stories of the old wars. They didn't have much to trade these days, but the children always brought flowers, pressed between pages of old books. Oswin wrapped their bread in thick cloth to keep it warm longer. The third was for Anselm, the night watchman, who rarely ate before dusk and always asked for the darkest loaf as he liked it to bite back. Oswin gave him the end crusts, the kind with bark-thick crunch. And the last was for Clara, the midwife, who was attending a birth that very night. He added a small honey roll to her bundle. Midwives needed more than bread. They needed comfort. By the time he had tied the final twine and stacked the parcels into his delivery basket, the rain had softened into mist, and the light outside had deepened into a coppery gray, the kind of light that only came between sunset and storm. He pulled on his cloak, worn and oiled against rain, and slung the basket over his shoulder. The door creaked as he opened it, and the smell of wet earth and chimney smoke met him like an old friend. The village felt hushed, not afraid, just folded into itself, like dough left to rise under a cloth. He walked slowly, each step deliberate to avoid the slick stones and puddles. The storm had cleaned the air, and the scent of herbs and wood lingered under the dampness. The lamplighter passed him near the chapel, nodding in silence, the pole over his shoulder still glowing faintly. At Widow Hesta's door, her niece appeared before he even knocked. "She's already wrapped herself in the shawl," the girl said with a smile. "Says she can smell the bread through the storm." Oswin handed her the bundle. "Tell her it's the same recipe her son liked. I added a little thyme." The girl looked up at him for a moment, as if weighing whether to say more. Then she simply nodded and stepped back into the warm light of home. At the Carrick house, the children came out squealing barefoot in the rain, their hair soaked, grins wide. They each took part of the cloth bundle and dashed inside, yelling something about soup night. Anselm was already waiting by the edge of the well, cloak dripping, eyes bright under his hood. "Bread?" he asked simply. "Still bites?" Oswin replied. They exchanged no coins, no words, just a nod. And then Anselm vanished down the alley like a shadow returning to its post. Finally, Oswin reached Clara's cottage. The candle was still lit in the front window, a signal. He knew, for still working. He did not knock. He simply left the bundle on the step, covered with a small oiled cloth to keep it dry. He stood there for a moment, hand resting on the stone gatepost. Somewhere inside, a cry pierced the air, not of pain, but of arrival, new life, and a storm-baked loaf to greet it. He returned to the bakery slowly, rain misting over his hood, footsteps echoing through the empty streets. By the time he reached his door, the sky had dimmed into indigo. The fire inside the oven had gone to sleep. The room glowed softly with the last of the lantern light, flickering against jars and cloth and flower bowls like memories half remembered. He placed the basket down, unhooked his cloak, and stood in the center of the room for a long moment. The bread was gone, but the warmth lingered. And that, he thought, was the true rhythm of a baker's life. Shape, rise, give, repeat, dinner and reflection. The rain had ceased. It hadn't so much stopped as it had simply faded, like a song that didn't need to finish, because it had already said enough. In its place was a hush so complete, Oswin could hear the slow drip of water from the eaves outside, each droplet hitting the stone like the second hand of a clock that had long forgotten urgency. Inside the bakery, the light had dimmed to a golden flicker. The lantern on the table cast slow-moving shadows across the walls, playing over jars of flour, bundles of herbs, and the old hearth, now resting. The oven, too, had gone quiet, still warm, but no longer glowing. It was a sleeping giant. Content with its work, Oswin moved slowly now. The briskness of morning had given way to the softness of evening, and the energy that once surged through his arms and legs had settled deep into his bones. He prepared his meal with care, not with the urgency of hunger, but with the tenderness of habit. A small iron pot was placed atop the banked coals in the hearth. Into it, he added a handful of pearl barley, a few dried beans, and a sliver of carrot from the market, sliced thin. He poured in water from the jug, then added a pinch of salt and the last of the nettle leaves Merwin's apprentice had given him. As it simmered, he sliced 2 pieces from the heel of a cooled loaf, not one of the decorative breads or sweet rounds, but a plain, dense loaf from the morning batch, slightly sour, speckled with grain. He toasted the slices near the fire, turning them with iron tongs until the crusts darkened and the smell of warmed grain filled the room once again. He sat at his table, laid out his small meal, and bowed his head not out of ritual, but respect. Then he ate. The stew was modest, the bread firm. The butter he spread across the toast was cool, taken from the stone shelf by the window. It melted slowly under the fire's warmth, pooling in the tiny valleys left by the bread's rise. He chewed slowly, each bite grounding him further into the quiet of the evening. Outside, the village had gone to sleep. No wheels creaked. No laughter echoed. The only sounds were the muffled bleats of sheep in distant pens, the rattle of shutters in a shifting breeze, and somewhere, the low song of a woman humming to a restless child. Oswin listened to it all without moving, and for the first time since sunrise, he allowed himself to feel tired, not just in the limbs, though they ached, but in the way only a full day can leave you. Whole, used, a little hollowed, a little filled. He looked down at the table, at the small dish of coarse salt beside his plate, the edge of a linen cloth stained from the afternoon's shaping. He brushed it with his thumb and let his thoughts wander. He thought of the children and their dragon-shaped loaves. He thought of the noblewoman who would never know the name of the man who baked her feast bread. He thought of the storm and the way it had wrapped the village like a quilt. And then, quietly, inevitably, he thought of Era, not in sadness, but in the way one remembers the smell of wildflowers in a summer field, long past vivid, but no longer aching. Her presence was everywhere in the bakery, in the shape of the clay mugs, in the slight tilt of the table she had insisted be moved just so, in the herb bundles above the stove that he still refused to take down. He finished his meal slowly, then rose to clean the dishes. The water from the kettle was still warm, and the linen cloth, though flour-dusted, was soft. He worked in silence, wiping the bowl, the spoon, the mug, drying each piece and setting it aside with care. Then, as he did each evening, he walked to the small shelf tucked beside the window and retrieved his notebook. It was leather-bound, the corners worn, its spine frayed from years of use. He sat back at the table, open to a blank page, and dipped his pen into the ink jar. He did not write long entries, only notes. Rain broke at dusk. Fire took well. Children's loaves better shaped this time. Clara's light still burning. He paused, tapping the pen lightly. Storm bread rose higher than expected, added rosemary. Another pause. Hera would have liked the quiet tonight. He closed the book gently and set it aside. The lantern's flame had begun to dim. He reached out and pinched the wick to silence. The room was now lit only by the coals in the hearth and the faint silver light of the moon breaking through the clouds outside. Oswin stood, stretched his arms overhead, and let out a long breath. He walked to the back room, where a narrow bed waited, covered in woolen blankets that still smelled faintly of lavender. Before lying down, he checked the small bowl of sponge starter near the shelf, fed and bubbling quietly in its sleep. Tomorrow's bread, already dreaming. He smiled. Then he lay down, pulled the blanket up to his chest, and closed his eyes. And in the deep, breathing silence of the bakery, as the last ember faded in the hearth, Oswin slept full, quiet, and at peace. The baker's journal. Dawn had not yet come, but Oswin was awake. Not fully, not with urgency or alarm, but in that soft state between dreams and waking, where the body stirs and the mind floats quietly in its own thoughts. The bakery was still and dark, save for the silver strip of moonlight that lay like a ribbon across the stone floor. He rose slowly, his joints creaking like old wood, and pulled on his cloak against the early chill. The hearth had long since cooled, and the ashes within were faintly glowing, like the breath of something ancient. He placed a small piece of birch kindling atop them and coaxed the flame back to life, not for baking, not yet, but for company. Then he lit the oil lamp and turned to the shelf above the work table. There it sat, the journal, leather-bound, thick, and worn along the edges. The corners had curled slightly from years of flour and handling. Its spine had split long ago, but had been mended with waxed thread and a prayer for endurance. Oswin lifted it as if lifting a loaf fresh from the oven, gently, reverently, with both hands. He sat at the table, set the lamp close, and opened to a random page. The scent of the book met him first. Old parchment, ink, dust, faint flour, and something else, memory. He read in silence. Third frost. Rye batch failed. Too coarse. Try scalding flour before mixing. The handwriting was his father's, straight. Tight strokes. Always in brown ink. It had been one of the first things Oswin copied when he started keeping the book himself. Not because he feared forgetting, but because it felt like conversation. He turned the page. Morning fire lit too hot. Lost the oat rounds. Ash on crust. Burned bottom. His own writing. But younger, sharper. More hurried. He remembered that morning well. He had been frustrated. Nearly thrown the whole tray. But his father had only said, "Write it down. Bread is more forgiving than pride." He smiled faintly. Farther on, the entries became longer, more personal. Elsbeth came alone today. Said her mother couldn't get out of bed. I gave her the milk loaf. No coin. But she sang the harvest song. Another. Added sage to the brown loaf for old Tom. He swore it helped his sleep. Or maybe it was just the warmth. Another still. Storm took half the roof. Baked anyway. Gave away most. Still had one left for Era. She said it tasted of wind. He paused there. His hand brushed the edge of that page, not to turn it, but to feel it. The ink had faded, but the impression of the words remained, pressed into the fibers by time and meaning. It struck him then how many loaves he had baked, not just in number, but in memory, each one a mark in the margins of someone's life. He flipped to the back section of the journal where recipes were written. There were no measurements, only phrases like "until it holds its shape," or "when it smells like morning," or "not too wet," "not too proud." Some would find it useless, but to Oswin, each line was precise. Here was the wedding loaf, honey from the new jar, flour sifted thrice, shaped with care, and baked during birdsong. Here was the loaf for funerals, barley, a touch of ash, rosemary if it grew near the grave, and the midwife's bread, soft crumb, sweetened with apple, must be warm when given. He closed the book slowly, letting his hand rest atop the cover. This was not just a ledger of baking. It was a map of the village, a record of its births, its losses, its winters and recoveries. The journal did not belong to him. Not truly. It belonged to time. He had only been the one to hold the pen. He stood and returned the book to the shelf, setting it upright between two small jars of dried fennel and bay leaf. Then he turned to the hearth. The kindling had caught. The flame danced lightly now, warming the stones and casting long shadows that waved like wheat in wind. He stepped outside. The village lay wrapped in pre-dawn stillness. Chimneys smoked lazily, and a single rooster crowed, as if testing the silence. The rain had washed the world clean, and the sky was beginning to lighten in streaks of gray-blue, like bread dough just before it turns golden. Oswin breathed in the cold air. Then he returned inside. The fire was ready. The dough starter from the night before was bubbling gently, and somewhere behind him, on a shelf above his life's work, the journal waited not to be read again today. Perhaps, but simply to exist, like him. Oswin did not return the journal to the shelf just yet. Instead, he ran his fingers along its spine again, then flipped to the very first page. Not the first recipe, but the front flap, where, in trembling ink, someone had written in all capitals, "In this house, the oven stands for all." It was not his father's hand. It was his grandfather's. Oswin remembered the man only in fragments, a gruff voice, a beard like wire, and a cane that struck the ground with purpose. But he remembered the stories even more clearly. How grandfather woke before anyone. How he burned the first 5 loaves he ever tried to make. How he fed bread to a passing knight once, and the man returned a year later to ask for more. This journal had begun with him. The early pages were brief and precise. No poetry. No notes of the village. Use warm milk in frost months. Salt must be ground in mortar, not fingers. 3 turns of the dough before folding, not 2, or it will split in the oven. Then, gradually, a change, a softer note in the handwriting, like the quieting of a man through years. There were entries with names now, mentions of births, illnesses, kind words from the clergy. The baker's duty is not only to bake it, is to witness. Oswin's father had added his own little annotations in red ink. Use barley if wheat is dear. 1 fire for baking. 1 for grieving. These notes weren't just recipes. They were a system of memory. A compass made of flour and heat. They told Oswin what the world was like when he was still a boy. What was planted. What was feared. What was given in love. He turned to one page bookmarked with a faded pressed violet. Ira's first visit. She asked if Doe could learn to sing. I told her yes if you listen closely. She laughed. Took the heel crust with honey. Said it tasted like bravery. He didn't remember writing that, but he remembered the day. She had come to the bakery for the first time after market, her hair wind-tossed. Her fingers stained with nettle from the herbalist's cart. She'd smiled, not at the bread, but at the way he held it, as though it might break or fly away. That day, everything had changed. He closed the book again, more slowly this time. There were things he had never written in it, not because he feared remembering, but because he didn't yet know how to turn them into words. The moment he first baked a loaf alone, the morning he scattered his father's ashes on the old garden behind the bakery, The day he heard laughter again after Era's passing and didn't flinch. Perhaps some things weren't meant to be written. Perhaps just feeling them was enough. Still, he opened to the final pages, the empty ones. There were only a dozen left. He had filled the rest over decades. He stared at the blank page in the lamp's soft light. Then he picked up his pen and began to write, not just a note or a recipe this time, but something slower, fuller. The oven is quieter now, not from lack of work, but from listening more closely. The children come with laughter instead of coin. The bread knows their names. The fire still burns. The loaves still rise. But I am no longer teaching the dough, it is teaching me. He paused. The ink bled slightly on the page. I have begun to wonder if the village needs more than bread, or if the bread has always been enough. He set down the pen, not because he had finished, but because it felt like the right place to stop. Then, without looking again, he stood. He walked across the room and opened a drawer beneath the work table. From it, he took a fresh book, thinner, unmarked, its pages crisp and white. He placed it beside the old one on the shelf, not to replace it, but to wait, to be ready. He did not yet know whose hands would fill that new journal. It might be a neighbor's son, a distant cousin, a child who wandered in one day, wide-eyed and curious, asking if bread was alive. Whoever they were, Oswin would leave them both books, one filled, one empty. He stepped outside once more before the sky brightened completely. The village was beginning to breathe again. A rooster crowed in earnest this time. A cart creaked down the path. Somewhere, a dog barked. But here, in the still space between night and morning, Oswin stood with his hands tucked into his cloak, watching the sky shift from deep indigo to that tender blue that only came before sunrise. He thought again of his grandfather's words, "The oven stands for all." He hadn't understood it when he was younger. It sounded like nonsense. But now, older, standing here, Oswin finally knew what it meant. It meant warmth in winter. It meant light in silence. It meant rising always. Always rising, even after the fall. He went back inside, closed the door, and began to prepare the flour for the day ahead, preparing for tomorrow. The flour dust hadn't yet risen. The oven was still in repose. And the village, though beginning to murmur, hadn't yet reached its daily rhythm. Carts hadn't rattled through the street. No children had called out. No footsteps yet passed the bakery door. But Oswin was already moving, quiet as breath, sure as dawn. He swept the hearth first. The ashes from yesterday's fire, now cooled to a fine gray veil, were scooped into a clay bucket. He always did this in silence, honoring the fire that had fed the village. Even the ash, he believed, had its place. He would spread it around the garden behind the bakery later, where the wild mint and marjoram grew. The plants, in their own way, remembered the fire. With the hearth clean, he wiped down the stone lip of the oven and checked the door hinges for any resistance. The iron was still warm to the touch, echoes of yesterday's heat, lingering like ghosts, refusing to leave. He smiled at that. Bread was like that, too, always leaving behind its scent, its warmth, its impression. He moved next to the work table. The flour sacks were half full, the surface still bearing the faint outlines of yesterday's kneading. He swept it clean with a worn linen cloth, one corner embroidered with a crooked sprig of thyme. It had been stitched by Era, years ago, as a gift, on the day he took full ownership of the bakery. He folded the cloth gently and placed it on the shelf, then pulled a fresh one from the drawer. Then he checked the sponge. The bowl had been resting in the cool corner near the window, wrapped in linen to protect it from the early chill. He uncovered it slowly. The surface was dimpled with bubbles, and the smell sharp, tangy. Alive told him it was ready. The starter had survived another night. He dipped his fingers into it and gave it one gentle stir. "You're ready." "Then," he murmured, as if to an old companion. Next came the water. He fetched it from the rain barrel behind the bakery, clear, cold, and still carrying the scent of last night's storm. He poured it into the clay basin and let it sit while he gathered the other ingredients. Coarse salt from the merchant's pouch, a small bowl of dried rosemary, and the first scoop of flour from the newest sack. He sifted the flour slowly, letting it fall like snow into the mixing bowl. Each pass through the screen removed more than lumps. It removed yesterday. What remained was soft, fine, open to whatever the new day would ask. He didn't rush. There was no clock here, only instinct. When the flour was ready, he added the salt, the herbs, and the sponge. Then the water. His hands met the mixture gently, coaxing it into a dough not by force, but by faith. He pressed and folded, the same movements he had made for decades. It was muscle memory by now, but it still felt sacred. The dough was wetter today. The humidity from the storm still clung to the air. He adjusted instinctively, adding a handful of flour, working it into the mass until it reached the texture he knew. Soft but elastic, sticky but not clinging. Once shaped into a rough round. He covered it with a damp cloth and set it in the warm corner near the hearth to rise. Then he turned to the rest of the room. The bread racks were empty now, save for one forgotten roll from the children's batch the day before. It had a lopsided swirl of honey baked into the crust. He picked it up, turned it over in his hand, and smiled. It would make a good breakfast. He took it to the back room and sliced it in half, placing both pieces near the edge of the hearth to warm while he brewed a small pot of tea nettle and apple peel, with a touch of mint from the garden. While it steeped, he sat near the window. The sky was glowing now, no longer dark, not yet gold, the kind of light that made even the stone look soft. He sipped the tea and ate the warm bread slowly, watching as the first figure appeared in the lane, a milkmaid with 2 pails, walking at a steady rhythm. Then a pair of boys on their way to the woodpile. Then the weaver with his basket of thread. Then old Tom, always the first to lean on the well. Life resumed, not with fanfare, but with footsteps. Oswin stood once more. He cleaned the pot, wiped down the table, and checked the dough. It had begun to rise, just slightly, like breath returning to the lungs after sleep. He smiled again quietly, fully. Then he gathered the delivery basket from its hook, emptied it of yesterday's cloths, and refolded them neatly. He placed them back in their drawer, each one ready to wrap the day's work. He set out the scoring blade, the baking peel, the clean boards for shaping. Everything had a place. Everything would be used again. Finally, he walked to the door and unbolted it. The morning air met him with a cool kiss. The bakery exhaled, and the world, still wrapped in its own warmth, turned gently toward the light. Tomorrow had begun, and Oswin, as he had done for decades, was ready. The dream of warm bread. That night, the bakery sighed with silence. The last loaf of the day had been baked, cooled, and wrapped. The fire had been fed once more, only enough to keep the chill from creeping too far into the stone walls. The tools had been cleaned and dried, the table wiped down, and the starter fed for the next day. Everything rested: bowls, blades, baskets as if exhaling together after a long, meaningful song. And Oswin, too, was ready to rest. He moved through the bakery slowly, checking small details, not because he had to, but because he wanted to, because the act itself soothed him. The shutters were latched. The door was bolted. The window over the work table, just slightly open, let in the cool hush of night air filled with the scent of distant wood smoke and something faintly floral, perhaps wild thyme, perhaps the dream of a garden. He poured himself a small cup of warm milk, stirred with honey and a pinch of nutmeg, and sat on the wooden bench near the hearth. The fire flickered low, a soft amber glow licking the edges of the soot-stained bricks. He drank slowly, letting the warmth settle into him like dough in its final proof. He felt the ache in his hands, the wear in his knees, the fatigue that crept not suddenly, but gently, like an old friend returning home. But more than that, he felt full, not with food, not even with pride, just full of something softer, deeper, a kind of peace that doesn't announce itself. It simply arrives, like the scent of bread through a closed door. He set the empty cup aside and moved to the back room, where his bed awaited, narrow, but clean, layered with thick woolen blankets. Before lying down, he did one last thing. He approached the shelf beside the window. There, between the jar of dried fennel and the clay pot of chalk, sat the two books, the journal now nearly filled, and the new one still blank, still waiting. He placed his hand on both, not to open them, but simply to acknowledge them. Then he turned away and lay down. The candle by his bedside guttered once, then fell dark, and slowly Oswin drifted in his dream He stood in the bakery again, but it was not the same. The walls glowed brighter than fire could make them. The air was warm, but not from heat, from something kinder. Outside the windows, the world was gold. Not sunset, not dawn, but something between, timeless, and in the oven. Bread baked, dozens of loaves, all shapes, all sizes, each one bearing a mark he remembered or had forgotten or had never made at all. He saw his father there, near the fire, checking the rise with his calloused hands. His grandfather, too, leaning on his cane, nodding silently. Even Ira, standing by the window, smiling softly, hands stained with flour, as if she had just finished shaping the dough herself. Children ran in and out of the room, arms full of rolls shaped like fish, dragons, stars. A young woman, unfamiliar but familiar, stood at the table, scoring loaves with a steady hand, and in the corner, a journal lay open. The page was blank, and a pen waited. Oswin stepped forward and picked it up. He wrote one line, "The bread remembers." Then the scent hit him rich, dark, golden. He turned. A single loaf sat before him on the table, still warm. He reached for it, and in that moment, not waking, not sleeping, not quite dreaming, he understood. Bread does not last, but the warmth does. The memory, the giving, the rising, in the early morning light. Before even the birds had stirred, a faint curl of smoke rose once more from the bakery chimney. Not much, just enough to suggest a fire was being coaxed alive again. And in the village, doors would soon creak open, boots would step into dew, voices would greet the day, and bread warm, honest, ancient would rise once more. Because that is what bread does, and what Oswin always believed. As long as the oven is warm, the world will go on.